Hello and welcome to DataCast Solutions Introduction to KNIME for the Data Analyst. In this chapter I'm going to walk you through an overview of the actual software and show you what all the major components are for the Windows. When you first launch KNIME, the first thing it's going to ask you to do is to choose a workspace. The workspace is simply a directory on any drive with sufficient space for you to store your workflows. All of your workflows will be stored as a subfolder underneath this directory on your machine. This is what the KNIME primary screen looks like. So let's talk about what each section of this is for, and then we'll go into detail of each section. In the top left corner, we have the KNIME Explorer, where you can browse through all of the workflows that you have created. Just below that is the Workflow Coach, which offers you ideas for nodes that you could be using further. Beneath that is the Node Repository. This is a list of all of the nodes that you have available to you in KNIME, and we'll show you how to use that shortly. Next is the Workflow Editor. This is the place where you're going to be actually building your workflows by dragging and dropping nodes. To the far right is the node description. Each node that you highlight in the node repository will show a description of what that node is doing. The outline view, when you have a workflow that extends beyond the area of the workflow editor, depending on how far you've zoomed in or out, the outline view shows you the total view of the workflow so you can see where you are relative to what's visible in the workflow editor. And finally, the console, probably one of the most important areas, because as you execute nodes, any messages that KNIME has to present to you will be presented in that console. So you'll be able to see them and respond to them as necessary. So with that as an introduction, let's go ahead and explore each one of these in a little more detail and see exactly how these work. So let's go ahead and let's take a look up at the KNIME Explorer and look at this in more detail. We will talk about the example workflows in the KNIME Hub in a future chapter. For now, your local workspace. This is the directory that you first, when you started KNIME, you were asked for your KNIME workspace directory. That is mapped to what you call here the local workspace. Underneath here are any work groups that you have defined. And if I right click over here, I can create a new group, which is just another folder. So you can structure your workflows into a folder structure so you can save them in a meaningful, logical way. And underneath each workflow, I can go into the examples and basic examples. And I'm going to open, in this case, for example, I could open the building a simple classifier. What's meaningful to note is behind the scenes, if you notice when I take a look at the D drive KNIME workspace, which is where I open my KNIME platform up to, you can see that each folder in my local workspace maps to a specific directory of the exact same name. So there is the example workflows, basic examples, and building a simple classifier, exactly as you saw them. And what you'll notice is that each node inside of each workflow stores a directory underneath there. That's where the configuration of the node is stored and any data that might be stored at each individual step. We'll talk more about that when we're working with workflows. Next, I mentioned the Workflow Coach. And what the Workflow Coach's job is to essentially try to guess through AI what the next node is you might be needing in your process. I'll be honest with you, I'm not a real big fan of this because I know the node I need. I don't need it to guess, and I've never found it particularly helpful at guessing for me. So as a general rule of thumb, I tend to close this node and not keep it open because I prefer the space available to the Explorer and the node repository. So if you find this isn't helpful to you, you just do what I do here and just close this view and it won't be visible anymore. So the next area I'd like to talk about is the node repository, probably the most important because this has all of the nodes that are available to you and what you can do with them. Now you have a few different mechanisms. You can browse this yourself, and initially that's probably honestly what you're going to have to do. You'll have to say, I want to do some type of I/O. So am I trying to read data or am I trying to write data? And once I read data, it's in an Excel spreadsheet, a CSV reader. Am I trying to read images? This is basically how most people tend to find nodes. And when they want to manipulate something, they'll come in and say, I want to manipulate is either the row or the table or the column. Well, if I want to do column level manipulation, then am I trying to split or combine them or transform them, change their case, handle missing values? So all of this is all set around the idea that you need to browse and find nodes. Once you start working with KNIME more and more, you're going to become very familiar with the standard nodes that you use all the time. So in the search box, if I type CSV, I get everything I need. Here's my CSV reader, CSV writer, and you'll just begin to learn to look and say, I can look for PDF and say, oh, here's how to convert a table to a PDF, how to parse a PDF. Write out to a PDF. There are lots of different, options that are going to be available to you, and you'll just get to know how to use these modules. But for now, just finding them is the key thing. So if you're trying to look for Excel and say, look, boy, here's every node that starts with XLS, all the Excel readers, sheet appenders, and everything that I want to work with. So the node repository, once you have a node, it is simple as taking this node and dragging it up onto the screen. If I drag this node and drag it up onto the screen into my workflow editor, voila, my node is now up here and part of it. So we'll talk more about the workflow editor in just a few moments. The outline view at the bottom, as you'll notice when at the top of the screen, in the workflow editor up here, you see that the workflow I built has scroll bars. It's beyond the physical limits of the workflow editor space that I've set aside. And what the outline view allows you to see is everything that you can't see. So it's basically a small capture area. So you can actually move by clicking and dragging, you can move this around and actually see the workflow. This may not seem useful, but when you build really, really large workflows, and they tend to get very large very quickly, navigating them around this becomes helpful. But we're going to also learn some techniques to use components and meta nodes to make your workflow much more manageable and much more readable. Since I've just opened KNIME, the startup menu down at the bottom, the startup messages, are actually being displayed. So any information when you first start up KNIME will show up in the console area as a separate tab. Once you've resolved or handled or managed anything that has to be as part of startup, you can close that. This leaves open just the console, and any messages that your workflow has produced are going to be visible in the console. So this is going to be a central area you're going to use regularly. There is, however, one other area of the console I like to open up and keep available on a very regular basis, and that's for managing and monitoring the flow variables that are being used throughout your workflow. So I'm going to zoom out here again, and I'm going to take you up instead into the View menu, and I'm going to ask you to open the other views, and then we're going to scroll down to the KNIME views.